As August 1944 wore on, the Allied forces found themselves in an unexpected bind. The liberation of France had seemed like a triumph, Normandy, a long-awaited breakthrough. But as the rapid advance of General Patton's forces tore through the heart of Western Europe, the momentum came to a sudden halt. It wasn't enemy resistance, nor even the weather, that threatened their march. It was fuel. The supply lines, stretched to their limits, could not keep pace with the relentless advance of tanks, trucks, and infantry. Fuel, ammunition, and vital supplies were depleting faster than anticipated. The situation grew increasingly dire. Patton's tanks, once unstoppable, now sat immobilized along the roadsides of France, engines cold and silent. Infantry units, vulnerable and exposed, found themselves lacking the artillery support they needed to continue pushing forward. The enemy was retreating, but the Allies, caught in an unthinkable trap of their own making, could not capitalize on their own success. In the command tents, the discussion grew tense. Should they halt the advance? Or should they push through the logistical chaos, risking further depletion? In the midst of the crisis, an unlikely solution emerged. Amidst the piles of rejected designs and forgotten equipment, a crude, cumbersome truck prototype from an obscure manufacturer was rediscovered. It seemed like an afterthought, a design deemed impractical, too unrefined to be of any use. Yet in the face of impending failure, officers began to reconsider. Could this worthless truck, once dismissed by experts, provide the necessary logistical lifeline? The debate was heated, but as the hours passed, the realization began to sink in. Without an immediate solution, Patton's breakthrough could come to an end, not by enemy fire, but by a lack of supplies. Germany had begun its retreat, yet the irony of the situation was glaring. The Allied tanks, now immobilized, were unable to take advantage of their enemy's flight. Victory was within reach, but the road forward lay blocked by the scarcity of fuel. In a warehouse hundreds of miles away, another engineer was about to solve the problem that would change everything. As the United States geared up for war in the early 1940s, not all heroes wore uniforms or commanded battalions. Sergeant Walter "Red" Calhoun, a mechanic with the U.S. Army, was a man of uncommon vision, a man who saw the battlefield not just through the lens of weapons, but through the machines that carried them. His proposal was radical, a truck design focused not on size or power, but on sheer durability and ease of repair. He believed that in the chaos of war, simplicity was the key. His design was built to be maintained by soldiers themselves, a far cry from the complex, heavy models favored by military brass. The military leadership, enamored with more sophisticated, standardized vehicles, dismissed Calhoun's idea outright. It was too crude, they said, too unconventional. Yet Calhoun did not give up. While official channels ignored his ideas, he quietly set to work. He began to modify existing military vehicles, strengthening their frames, enhancing their cooling systems, and ensuring that the most common breakdowns could be easily fixed in the field. His efforts were not heralded by medals or accolades, but his modifications turned out to be something far more important, practical. They worked. While official vehicles faltered in grueling tests, often breaking down under the stresses of rough terrain and long, punishing hours, Calhoun's modified trucks kept going. They were outlasting the very machines that had been touted as the future of military transport. But even as his trucks proved their worth, the bureaucracy of the war machine was relentless. The military machine, now in full swing, did not have room for the quiet mechanic from the back of the depot. Calhoun's work was buried under the weight of red tape, overlooked as the war effort expanded and demands grew. For years, his modifications remained unrecognized, hidden in the shadow of more glamorous innovations. Yet in the heat of battle with the Allies, advance grinding to a halt, Calhoun's forgotten work was about to be rediscovered. The logistical collapse that threatened the Allies, momentum would soon lead a commander to stumble upon Calhoun's designs. But could these humble modifications truly save the day? What they didn't know was that these uncelebrated changes would soon reshape the very course of the war. By the summer of 1944, General George S. Patton's forces were surging through France in a rapid, all-consuming advance. The Allies, buoyed by their success in Normandy, were pushing deep into enemy territory. But beneath the roar of tanks and the exhilaration of liberation, a quiet crisis began to take shape. Patton's tanks, mighty symbols of Allied might, were burning through fuel at an astonishing rate, faster than supply lines could replenish. What was meant to be a wrap. Its breakthrough was now threatened by a simple but deadly shortfall: fuel. The logistical chain, stretched beyond capacity, began to buckle. Tanks sat idle along the roadsides, their engines cold, their treads stuck in place. Ammunition, weapons, and supplies were piling up in warehouses, untouched, unable to reach the front due to the lack of fuel. The battlefronts, which had been advancing steadily, now seemed paralyzed by a bottleneck in the very lifeblood of the war effort. With Patton's Blitz now grinding to a halt, there seemed to be no clear way forward. In the midst of this chaos, Calhoun's modified trucks were called into action. Though crude in design, loud, rough, and far from the polished vehicles of standard issue, they were tested under the brutal conditions of the front lines. These trucks, born from a mechanic's uncelebrated genius, were about to face their proving ground. Despite their unrefined exterior, they held a stubborn resilience. Yet, skepticism was thick in the air. Many commanders, familiar with the slick and sophisticated models, doubted that these ugly, makeshift vehicles would survive the punishing terrain and stress of battle. They were, after all, just trucks, roughly modified, often considered unworthy of attention. But the Allies had few other options. The dilemma was stark. Without a solution, Patton's advance could come to an abrupt and unexpected halt, not due to enemy action, but a logistical collapse of their own making. And so, with the fate of the campaign hanging in the balance, the decision was made. Calhoun's trucks were approved for use, despite their rough edges. In the face of uncertainty, they would be the lifeline that might keep the momentum of the war machine moving forward. But would they hold up when the real test came? What they didn't know was that these simple, unrefined trucks would soon become the silent heroes of the advance. In late 1944, the Allies faced a logistical crisis of staggering proportions. General Patton's forces, though advancing relentlessly through France, were at the mercy of a broken supply chain. Fuel, ammunition, food, the very essentials of warfare were trapped behind the front lines. The solution, born from necessity, was the creation of the Red Ball Express, a network of convoys that would run day and night, delivering supplies directly to Patton's troops. But the scale of the operation filled military planners with doubt. Thousands of trucks, pouring down single-lane roads, moving relentlessly in a continuous loop. A logistical nightmare, they believed. No room for mistakes. One breakdown, one accident, and the whole system would collapse. Amid the growing skepticism, Sergeant Walter Red Calhoun's design offered a glimmer of hope. His modified trucks, ugly, loud, and unrefined, were the backbone of the Red Ball Express. Calhoun, however, was convinced that strict discipline could make the convoys work. No stops, no deviations. His approach was simple, almost brutal. Every truck must keep moving. Drivers would rest when their shift ended. Trucks would be repaired on the move. Calhoun's plan, while unconventional, relied on one thing: an ironclad structure that left no room for error. The system, once considered reckless, now became a potential lifeline for Patton's forces. But many military leaders remained unconvinced. Despite Calhoun's insistence, traditional methods of logistics still held sway. The planners clung to their long-standing systems, incapable of adapting quickly enough to the urgency of the situation. They believed the trucks, no matter how modified, would not be able to endure. The convoys, they reasoned, would last no longer than a few days before the wear and tear overwhelmed them. They would burn out. The harsh conditions of the European front, mud, snow, and roads torn to pieces by constant shelling, would be too much for any vehicle to handle. It was a theory supported by experience, but also one that ignored the tenacity built into Calhoun's designs. When the first Red Ball Express convoys rolled out, the outcome was far from what anyone expected. The modified trucks, built for durability, began to outperform their more sophisticated counterparts. They resisted breakdowns and suffered far fewer mechanical failures than anticipated. The system, despite the fears of the high command, ran smoothly. The convoys, driving endlessly, non-stop, managed to push forward, inching supplies ever closer to the front. Days turned into weeks, and still, the trucks kept running, carrying their heavy loads across the war-torn roads of France. The skepticism that had surrounded the operation began to shift. What was once considered a reckless gamble was now a proven success. The Allied forces moving toward victory now had the lifeline they so desperately needed. The Red Ball Express had become the thread that held Patton's advance together. But the real question remained: would this improbable success continue? Could this fragile system truly sustain the momentum of the war effort in the long run? Only time would tell, but one thing was clear. The trucks that no one believed in had become the unsung heroes of the war's logistics. As the first convoys of the Red Ball Express rolled out in early September 1944, the roads of France became a lifeline. crucial arteries of supply cutting through the heart of a war-ravaged land. The mission was clear: keep the trucks moving, no matter the conditions, no matter the cost. Yet from the very first mile, the men driving these trucks faced an uphill battle. For many of them, it was the first time navigating the twisting, broken roads of France, and the challenges were unforgiving. The drivers, many of whom were African-American soldiers, previously relegated to service and support roles, were now thrust into one of the most critical logistical efforts of the war. They were expected to maintain order and discipline across an unfamiliar landscape, where the faintest mistake could halt the entire supply chain. Sergeant Calhoun's system, rigid and unforgiving, was the backbone of the operation. Drivers were to maintain strict spacing, avoid stopping for any reason, and in many cases, drive under the cover of blackout conditions to protect the convoys from enemy fire. Every second counted, every detail was paramount. The men drove through the night, their engines roaring against the darkened roads, the constant rhythm of tires on gravel marking the passage of time. Discipline was the key to survival. Yet in a war where nothing was predictable, even the most well-laid plans could falter. As the convoys pressed on, it became clear that the strain on the trucks was greater than expected. Fuel consumption soared. Trucks, pushed to their limits, broke down in the middle of the night, leaving gaps in the flow of supplies. Despite the mounting challenges, there was a glimmer of hope. The convoys continued to function, inching closer to the front lines with each passing day. The trucks, ugly and crude, had begun to prove their worth, not by the strict efficiency of their design, but by their sheer resilience. The drivers, many of whom had never been mechanics, found themselves improvising repairs on the fly. A broken axle could be patched with spare parts scavenged from the side of the road. A damaged engine might be revived with a wrench and a dash of ingenuity. There was no time for doubt, no room for hesitation. Every truck that continued its journey became a small victory, proof that the system could hold despite its flaws. By mid-September, the belief in the Red Ball Express began to grow, not because the plan had been flawless, but because of the incredible adaptability and strength of the trucks and their drivers. What had once seemed like a temporary solution had transformed into something much more profound. The trucks, often mocked for their crude design, were now the lifeline that sustained Patton's forces, delivering fuel, ammunition, and food to where it was needed most. And as the Allies continued their push into Europe, the question loomed larger. Could this resilient convoy system continue to carry them all the way to victory? Or would the road ahead be too much, even for these unheralded machines? As the convoys moved forward, they carried not just supplies, but a new belief, one forged in the dust of the road and the grit of the men behind the wheel. But could they keep pace with the ever-growing demands of the front lines? By the fall of 1944, the Red Ball Express had evolved from a desperate logistical experiment into the beating heart of the Allied advance across France. Yet, despite its success, the official military trucks, powerful and standardized, began to falter. The GMC CCKWs, the workhorses of the American supply effort, were simply not built for the relentless pace demanded by the war. They were designed for more conventional uses, not for the constant, unyielding strain of the Red Ball convoys. As the trucks moved across France, their engines grew hot, their frames buckled under the heavy loads, and the wheels began to wear down faster than anyone could have anticipated. Each breakdown added more time and cost to an operation already under extreme pressure. They were machines built for peacetime, thrust into the chaos of war. Meanwhile, Calhoun's modified trucks, once considered crude and inefficient, continued to exceed all expectations. His design, born from necessity and built on practicality, had proven itself to be far more resilient than anyone had imagined. The trucks, rugged frames, simple modifications, and ability to be repaired on the move had turned them into the perfect vehicle for the harsh demands of the Red Ball Express. They may have lacked the sleek efficiency of their official counterparts, but they thrived in ways the military had not anticipated. What was once thought to be an impractical, even laughable, design was now a vital asset in the war effort. In response to this unexpected success, army workshops across Europe scrambled to replicate Calhoun's modifications. What had started as a single, unauthorized mechanic's solution to a logistical problem now became a mass-produced answer to the mounting strain. Military engineers, once dismissive of the design, began to realize the truck's value. They began reinforcing frames, installing improved cooling systems, and making adjustments that mirrored Calhoun's ingenious alterations. Soon, the modified trucks were being rolled out in greater numbers, filling the ranks of the Red Ball Express. These trucks, once an afterthought, were now the backbone of the supply line, delivering critical supplies to the front lines, keeping Patton's forces moving. As the Red Ball Express expanded, the pressure on these trucks mounted. Patton's forces demanded more fuel, more ammunition, and more food, and the supply lines, fueled by Calhoun's modifications, were the only thing standing between the advancing army and logistical collapse. The trucks had become indispensable, carrying the weight of the war on their backs. What had begun as a desperate, makeshift solution had evolved into something far more significant, a symbol of ingenuity in the face of crisis. The modified trucks were no longer just vehicles. They were the unsung heroes of the war effort, quietly ensuring that the tide of battle could continue to turn in favor of the Allies. But even as the trucks proved their worth, a pressing question lingered. Could these machines, designed for a war they were never meant to fight, continue to endure under the mounting demands? Or would the very resilience that made them successful eventually be their downfall? As 1944 drew to a close, the night became the stage for the most relentless and crucial phase of the Red Ball Express. The convoys, already an essential lifeline for the Allied advance, now faced conditions that threatened to overwhelm them. Dense fog hung over the roads as rain poured in sheets, turning the already perilous paths into slippery, treacherous nightmares. The convoy drivers, many of them volunteers, many just trying to stay alive, had little choice but to keep moving. Visibility was minimal, with barely enough road markers to guide them through the vast darkness that swallowed up the countryside. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, they did not stop. They could not afford to. The trucks, modified under Calhoun's direction, had already proven themselves on the road, but the brutal demands of these late-night runs pushed them further than anyone had anticipated. The modifications, strengthened frames, reinforced axles, and improved cooling systems were now proving their worth in the most unforgiving conditions. These vehicles, once dismissed as ugly and impractical, were now showing a resilience that seemed near invincible. The upgrades that had been seen as mere afterthoughts in the early days of the war had become the difference between life and death on the supply roads of France. In the cold, wet darkness, the trucks chugged on, their engines sputtering but never quite failing. The irony was not lost on those who had watched Calhoun's design be rejected by military planners. The trucks, once laughed at for their crude simplicity, had become the very machines that were sustaining the Allies' march across Europe. These vehicles, unrefined and rough, could handle the grueling hours, the extreme wear and tear, and the harshest of conditions. Their ability to continue running, hour after hour, under the weight of constant use and impossible weather, was a testament to the genius of an unauthorized mechanic who had understood what the war truly required. And still, there were those who doubted. The pressure on the convoys was unrelenting. Day and night, the trucks ran, making 20-hour shifts, relentlessly moving supplies toward the front lines. Yet even with the best designs in place, the human element was a constant factor in the truck's survival. Drivers worked through fatigue, their eyes bleary, their hands sore, keeping the convoy intact. Despite mechanical breakdowns, despite the wear and tear on the men and machines alike, the trucks kept moving. And when one would falter, a driver would leap from the cab, quickly assessing the damage and making repairs in the most makeshift of conditions. The ability to keep the trucks operational, often under fire, became the hallmark of the Red Ball Express. This unyielding resilience was crucial to the war effort. As the convoys rolled on, their engines humming in the dark, a new sense of hope began to spread. The logistical nightmare that had once threatened to halt the Allied advance now appeared to be easing, if only slightly. With every load of fuel, ammunition, and food delivered, the front lines held, and the Allies' momentum was sustained. What had begun as a desperate response to a logistics crisis had evolved into a critical lifeline, one that would sustain the effort to peace. Ushered deeper into Europe, the trucks, powered by their unwavering engines, became a symbol of endurance. But even as the convoys continued to roll, the question remained. Could this system, this fragile web of trucks and drivers, continue to withstand the mounting pressure of a war that refused to slow down? The Red Ball Express had carried the Allies this far, but how long could it hold together under the weight of so many lives depending on it? In the distance, a new challenge loomed, one that could threaten everything the convoys had achieved. And somewhere, on a road coated in fog, the hum of a truck's engine continued to pierce the night. But would it be enough to carry them through what was coming next? As the sun dipped below the horizon in September 1944, a relentless hum filled the air across France. It wasn't the sound of battle, but the steady roar of engines, the rhythmic pulse of the Red Ball Express. Thousands of trucks, many of them carrying vital supplies, lumbered down worn-out roads under the cover of darkness, their headlights the only sign of life in the shadowed countryside. The convoys moved without fanfare, a thankless, uncelebrated task. There were no medals for the drivers, no parades for the mechanics. Yet this operation, overlooked by many, had become the lifeblood of the Allied push through Europe. Day and night, these trucks, fueled by a mixture of necessity and ingenuity, delivered thousands of tons of fuel, food, and ammunition to the front lines, allowing Patton's forces to keep advancing. Without them, victory would have been impossible. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. The convoys ran continuously, moving in 20-hour shifts, crisscrossing roads pocked with craters and littered with debris from the battles fought just days before. Yet the Red Ball Express, an effort once thought to be unsustainable, began to exceed expectations. Commanders watched in disbelief as the convoys, operating with precision and speed, outpaced even the most optimistic projections. Trucks were moving faster, covering more ground than anyone had thought possible. The once-thought impracticality of the operation had given way to undeniable efficiency. Despite the dangers of moving through territory constantly under threat of German attack, the convoy's speed and consistency were a marvel to those overseeing the campaign. And yet the irony of the Red Ball Express was not lost on those involved. While its vital role ensured the Allied success, history largely ignored it. The tanks and infantry that stormed Normandy, the airstrikes that devastated the German front, were celebrated in the annals of war. But it was the unassuming trucks, often regarded as simple, unglamorous machines, that quietly ensured those victories were possible. The trucks did not win battles on their own, but without them, the infantry and tanks would have been stranded, their weapons useless without the necessary fuel and supplies to keep fighting. And as the war drew deeper into the heart of Europe, the Red Ball Express became more and more indispensable. But for every mile the convoys covered, the toll on the trucks was heavy. Tires burned out under the strain, axles snapped under the weight of the constant load, and engines seized after hours of continuous running. The roads were unforgiving and the trucks were being pushed to their breaking points. Yet in each convoy, one thing remained constant: Calhoun's modifications. The trucks that had once been dismissed as inadequate and crude were now the backbone of the war effort. Calhoun's ingenious adjustments, reinforced frames, better cooling systems, and easier-to-repair components, kept the convoys moving even when the odds were stacked against them. While the official military vehicles faltered, the modified trucks endured, a testament to the quiet genius of an unheralded mechanic. With each passing day, the Red Ball Express grew more critical to the success of the Allied campaign. The trucks, once derided as makeshift, now powered the logistics chain that kept Patton's forces moving forward, all the way to the heart of Germany. Their presence on the battlefield was invisible to most, but their impact was undeniable. It wasn't just the infantry or the tanks that were driving the Allies toward victory. It was the trucks, working tirelessly behind the scenes, that kept the front line alive. As Patton's forces moved deeper into enemy territory, the P-47 trucks, once seen as a temporary solution, had become a permanent fixture in the war effort. But even as the convoys rolled on, one question lingered: could these trucks continue to endure? As the war pushed on toward Berlin, the strain on the Red Ball Express would only intensify. Could the lifeblood of the Allies, advance, keep flowing, or would the weight of the war finally prove too much for even the most resilient trucks? As the convoys rumbled on, their engines carried not just supplies, but the uncertain future of the Allied war effort. The road ahead was long, but it was clear. Without the Red Ball Express, the path to Berlin might never have been possible. As winter deepened in 1944, the relentless grind of the Red Ball Express took on a new, harsh dimension. The convoys, once an unremarkable part of the war effort, had now become essential to the survival of the Allies' campaign in Europe. But as the weather worsened, so did the toll on both men and machines. Exhaustion, frostbite, and fatigue gnawed at the soldiers behind the wheels, while mechanical breakdowns became an all-too-familiar occurrence. The trucks, battered by the elements, rolled on, through rain-soaked roads that turned into rivers, through mud that swallowed entire wheels, and through frost-covered stretches where engines refused to turn over. Yet somehow, despite everything, the convoys kept running. For every mile they covered, the strain on the trucks and their crews became ever more apparent. Tires burned out quicker in the cold, axles snapped under the weight of the constant loads, and engines failed from the stress of endless travel through punishing conditions. Yet the crews, faced with an ever-diminishing fleet, had no choice but to keep going. Cannibalization became a necessity. A truck would break down, and if its engine was too damaged to repair, parts would be stripped from it and used to revive another. Soldiers, working quickly and under pressure, learned to become mechanics, improvising repairs on site, often under enemy fire. It was a war of attrition, not just for the Allies but for the trucks that carried them forward. The irony of the situation was undeniable. These trucks, once mocked for their crude design and seen as inefficient, had become the backbone of the entire Allied logistical effort in Europe. They were the unsung heroes of the war, silently fueling the advance toward Berlin. What had started as a makeshift solution, a desperate answer to the chaos of war, had transformed into the lifeblood of the European theater. No one had anticipated that the modified vehicles, built out of necessity and desperation, would prove to be the most reliable workhorses of the campaign. And yet, here they were, day after day, carrying the weight of the war on their backs. But the toll was taking its effect. For the soldiers driving them, the road had become a cruel and unforgiving master. The physical and mental exhaustion of constant travel, paired with the strain of relentless repairs, was beginning to break the men. Many of them had not signed up for this kind of war, where the enemy was not just the German army but the road itself. Yet in the cold, dark nights, as the convoys trudged on through the muck and snow, there was no time for rest, no time to complain. No time to stop. If the trucks broke, they fixed them. If the drivers were too tired to stay awake, they found a way to keep going. The road itself had become a battlefront, a never-ending cycle of mud, snow, and dust, where every stretch of asphalt, every mile of rough road became an enemy in itself. The frost would seize up engines, the rain would drown the roads, and the mud would swallow entire vehicles whole. But the convoys, constantly fighting back, kept pushing forward. It was an endless cycle of repair and renewal. Every truck that limped through the night was a victory, every convoy that completed its route was a triumph. The toll on the men was immeasurable, but so too was their resilience. As the war in Europe raged on, it became painfully clear. The war could not continue without the Red Ball Express. The trucks, worn down by time and stress, had become the arteries of the Allied campaign. Without them, Patton's forces would have been stranded, and the momentum of the war would have ground to a halt. The road, once seen as nothing more than a means to an end, had become the lifeblood of the war effort. In a landscape that seemed to demand constant sacrifice, the men behind the wheels and the trucks themselves proved to be the very things that kept the war moving forward. But as the convoys pressed on, a question loomed larger with each passing day. How much longer could the Red Ball Express sustain the Allies' drive toward Berlin? The road, with its unyielding demands, had already taken so much. Would the convoys and the men who powered them be able to endure long enough to see the war through to its conclusion? The next phase of the war would soon reveal if the lifeline of the Allies could keep beating, or if it would finally snap under the strain. As the crisp days of fall settled over Europe in 1944, a new and pivotal operation was underway. Operation Market Garden, a bold Allied attempt to secure a series of key bridges across the Netherlands, was seen as a chance to deliver a decisive blow to the German forces. But to make this audacious operation work, a constant and uninterrupted flow of supplies would be essential. Patton's forces, already stretched thin by. The demands of the European campaign faced the unthinkable. They would need to double their logistical capacity to sustain the operation. And so, the burden once again fell to the Red Ball Express. What had been an essential but overlooked component of the war effort now became the very lifeline of Operation Market Garden. If the convoys failed, the operation would fail. There was no room for error. The trucks, already worn by months of continuous use, were pushed even harder. The weather, cold, rainy, and often near freezing, tested both the vehicles and their drivers. Visibility was poor, the roads were battered and muddy, and the pressure to keep supplies moving was unbearable. Yet despite the mounting strain, the Red Ball Express trucks kept moving, their engines rumbling through the night, shrouded by fog and darkness. It was a grueling, thankless job, but the trucks had become so ingrained in the effort that they could not be allowed to falter. Every convoy, every mile, was a reminder of just how critical their role had become. The trucks had become not just a means of transport, but a symbol of resilience. The modified vehicles, once thought inadequate for the task, now stood as the unsung heroes of the war, delivering everything from food to ammunition, ensuring that the operation remained viable, even as the odds stacked higher. But the weather wasn't the only enemy the convoys had to face. As the Red Ball Express moved through the dangerous terrain, the Germans made their own push to disrupt the critical supply lines. Raids targeted the convoys, attempting to cripple the lifeblood of the operation. Despite these relentless strikes, the soldiers of the Red Ball Express pushed forward undeterred. With each raid, the trucks' endurance became even more essential. The drivers, often operating on little rest and constant threat of attack, continued to deliver supplies, their focus unwavering. The enemy could strike at any moment, but the trucks kept moving. The convoys, battered by the weather and enemy raids, pressed on as if nothing could stop them. Their mechanical endurance, fueled by Calhoun's ingenious modifications, was more vital than ever before. In the face of such immense challenges, the true irony of the situation became painfully clear. What was once viewed as a makeshift solution, a crude, unreliable design, had now become the cornerstone of the Allies' logistical success. The truck's ability to endure long hours, extreme weather, and even mechanical failure without stopping for long repairs had made them indispensable. They were no longer seen as mere vehicles, but as the very essence of the war's progress. Without them, Operation Market Garden would not have had the chance to succeed. The P-47 trucks, once overlooked, now held the keys to the Allies' future. As the convoys rolled on through the mud and the frost, they carried with them not just supplies, but the hopes of a campaign that could change the course of the war. Despite the conditions, against all odds, the Red Ball Express delivered. It kept the flow of vital supplies moving, keeping Operation Market Garden alive longer than anyone had expected. What began as a desperate, often mocked solution had proven itself capable of much more. The ability to keep the trucks operational, to repair them on the fly, had allowed the Allies to maintain the momentum of their campaign, even when victory seemed distant. The true turning point of the war, it seemed, was not only in the battles fought on the ground or in the air, but in the quiet, uncelebrated work of the Red Ball Express. These unsung convoys, delivering fuel, ammunition, and food, were the pulse of the operation. Without them, there would have been no advance, no push forward, no hope of victory. And as the Allies continued their push into German-occupied territory, one thought lingered. Could the Red Ball Express continue to carry the weight of the war effort? The operation had been sustained by these trucks for so long, but the road ahead was longer, and the demands would only grow. Would the convoys, worn and battered, continue to fulfill their vital role, or would they finally succumb to the unrelenting pressure of war? What they didn't know was that the very trucks they relied on would soon face a test like no other. The bitter chill of winter 1944 had settled across Europe, and with it came the relentless push of the Allies toward Germany. The Red Ball Express, which had already proven itself indispensable to the Allied war effort, was now at the edge of its limits. The distance between supply depots and the front lines grew longer each day, the strain on the trucks mounting with each new mile. The roads, battered by months of incessant use and unyielding weather, were no longer just difficult, they were treacherous. Mud, ice, and snow combined to create a nightmare for the weary convoys, and as the trucks continued their endless runs, something began to give. The supply lines stretched too far, and the mechanical toll on the trucks became catastrophic. For every truck that limped along, another was left by the side of the road, abandoned in the freezing landscape. The constant pressure of keeping the trucks operational had finally taken its toll. Axles snapped, engines seized, tires disintegrated under the relentless strain. The men driving them, exhausted and near the breaking point themselves, could only keep going, their determination fueled by the ever-growing urgency of the mission. But there was no time to stop for repairs, no time to rest. With entire battalions of soldiers working as mobile repair units, the men fought not only the enemy but the very machines that had once been their lifeline. The trucks broke down constantly, but somehow, someway, the soldiers found a way to fix them on the go. It wasn't easy. There was no blueprint, no standard procedure, just the ingenuity and resolve of men who had no other choice but to make it work. The irony of the situation was palpable. These were the same trucks that had once been dismissed as crude, unreliable machines, ugly and impractical, as many had called them. Yet, despite the relentless breakdowns, the trucks continued to roll. The ingenuity of the soldiers, of men who had learned to repair engines on the side of the road, who had learned to make do with what little they had, became a testament to the spirit of the Red Ball Express. It was a paradox. A fleet of vehicles that should have long since given up continued to move forward, driven by the stubborn determination of the soldiers behind the wheel. What was once seen as a makeshift solution now stood as a symbol of resilience, proof that even the most basic machine could become indispensable when the will to keep going was strong enough. As the days stretched on and the cold became unbearable, morale among the troops began to fray. The men were exhausted, their bodies weathered from months of constant motion, and their spirits tested by an unyielding war. Yet despite the exhaustion, despite the pain and the cold, the trucks kept rolling, and so did the men. The convoys, which had once been seen as just another logistical operation, had become a crucial lifeline, delivering the supplies that kept the front lines alive. Each convoy that successfully completed its route was a victory in itself, an affirmation that despite everything, despite the mechanical failures, the exhaustion, the overwhelming pressure, the war could continue. The trucks had become more than mere machines. They had become a morale-boosting symbol of endurance. And so, as the Red Ball Express carried on into the depths of winter, it became clear. Without these trucks, without the soldiers who had kept them moving, the Allies' advance into Germany would have ground to a halt. The Red Ball Express had become more than just a logistical operation. It had become the very pulse of the war effort. What was once seen as a mundane task had grown into a monumental achievement, ensuring the continued success of the Allies' offensive. It was a logistical triumph, one that had allowed the soldiers on the front lines to continue their fight day after day without breaking. Without the trucks, victory would have remained out of reach. The true turning point of the war, it seemed, was not in the battles fought nor in the victories won on the ground. The true turning point lay in the unseen but vital network of supply lines that fed the advancing forces. The final stages of the war, it became evident, would rely on the trucks, the P-47 vehicles that had been the unsung heroes of the campaign. The trucks, though worn and battered, were still the key to victory. As they rolled toward the final battlefields of Europe, they proved that logistics, the tireless, invisible support system that kept the war machine running, was the true key to success. But as the trucks continued their journey, the question remained, how much longer could they endure? The road had already broken them. Could they make it to the final stages of the war, or would the strain finally be too much to bear? The soldiers, though weary, knew that victory was within reach. But the Red Ball Express, their lifeline, was now closer to breaking than ever before. Could it last long enough to deliver the final blow? The answer lay just ahead. As December 1944 deepened, the war's final stages grew increasingly perilous. The Germans, in a desperate push known as the Battle of the Bulge, had struck at the heart of the Allied forces, catching Patton's troops off guard. Surrounded and besieged, Patton's men faced the very real prospect of being trapped, their advance grinding to a halt. Yet, as the heavy artillery boomed and the cold, crisp air bit at their skin, something extraordinary began to unfold. The Red Ball Express, which had been providing vital support to Patton's forces throughout the campaign, was now tasked with shifting direction. The convoys would have to break the siege. Fuel, ammunition, and food, everything that could turn the tide, had to be delivered to those fighting on the front lines. In this bitterly cold, high-stakes moment, the Red Ball Express would prove to be the difference between life and death. Every convoy that successfully crossed the beleaguered roads represented more than just transportation. It represented hope, the heartbeat of the war effort. Each gallon of fuel delivered became a turning point in Patton's counteroffensive. Without those vital shipments, Patton's forces would not have had the fuel to move, to fight, to survive. The weight of the task ahead was crushing. The roads were a battlefield in themselves, clogged with snow, ice, and the bodies of both men and machines worn thin by the brutal months of fighting. Yet the convoys pressed on. They had no choice. The irony, however, was not lost on those who had doubted the Red Ball Express in its infancy. What had once been regarded as a makeshift logistical solution, the trucks that many believed were too crude and unreliable, had become the very mechanism that would ensure Allied success. The convoys, which had been written off as a temporary measure, had become the lifeblood of the war effort. Through every mechanical failure, through every breakdown and raid, these modified trucks, built on ingenuity and necessity, had continued to roll forward. Now they were delivering more than just supplies. They were delivering the very means to break through German lines and keep the fight alive. The trucks that were once mocked now stood as symbols of resilience. Despite the endless struggles, despite the fatigue and the unbearable cold, the Red Ball Express maintained the momentum of the Allies' counteroffensive. They had come through months of hardship, overcoming the most dire challenges, and now, as the battle raged around them, their role had never been more crucial. With every convoy that made it through the frigid roads, Patton's forces were one step closer to victory. The sheer determination of the men and the trucks ensured that the war machine kept moving. Through enemy fire, through mechanical failures, and through the bitter cold, the convoys delivered. This final push, which would ultimately see the Allies repel the German forces and secure the counteroffensive, was more than a military victory. It was a moral triumph, a demonstration of how logistics, the oft-forgotten backbone of war, could change the course of history. The Red Ball Express had become a vital thread in the fabric of the war. It had begun as a last-ditch emergency solution to a broken supply chain. But now, in the heart of the Battle of the Bulge, it had grown into something far greater. The trucks, those simple, durable machines, were no longer just tools of war, they were the pulse of the Allied advance. Without them, victory would have remained out of reach. What began as a logistical nightmare had, over the course of months, turned into a strategic asset. The convoys had evolved from an overlooked necessity to an indispensable force that allowed the Allies to push back against the Germans, to maintain momentum in the face of overwhelming odds. The roads that had once seemed like obstacles to victory had now become pathways to liberation. The Red Ball Express, which had delivered supplies under the most trying conditions, had become the unseen force that closed in on victory. And yet, as the convoys continued their endless runs through the frozen, war-torn landscape, one question lingered. How much longer could they sustain this pace? The war was far from over, and the Red Ball Express was stretched to its limits. Could the convoy system continue to deliver, or would the weight of its success finally break under the strain? What they did not know was that the final push into Germany would require an even greater sacrifice, one that would test the limits of endurance and resolve like never before. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. The Allied forces had pushed through the heart of Germany, breaking the back of the Nazi war machine. Patton's army was advancing steadily, and the front lines were beginning to shift as the final battles unfolded. The Red Ball Express, which had been the tireless lifeline of the war effort for over a year, was finally beginning to slow. The convoys, which had once been an unstoppable force, were no longer needed in the same numbers, but the trucks, the men who drove them, and the vital role they had played in the Allied success were far from forgotten. The legacy of the Red Ball Express was now secure, not just in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, but in the very fabric of military logistics itself. Despite the war winding down, the full weight of the Red Ball Express's contribution to the Allied victory was beginning to sink in. Commanders, who had once privately doubted the truck's ability to endure, now openly admitted that it was the trucks. Those modified P-47s, that had been critical in maintaining the momentum of the campaign. Without the Red Ball Express, the Allies' advance would have stalled, and months of fighting would have been wasted. Every gallon of fuel delivered, every convoy that made it to the front lines, kept the forces moving. What had started as a logistical stopgap had become the backbone of the war effort, a true testament to the power of innovation born from necessity. In the aftermath of the war, the world began to realize just how significant the Red Ball Express had been. Military logistics studies, conducted in the wake of the war, began to incorporate the lessons learned from the operation. Calhoun's modifications, once dismissed as crude and unnecessary, were now recognized as a pivotal development in military vehicle design. His simple changes, reinforced frames, better cooling systems, and easier-to-repair engines, became the foundation for future truck manufacturing. What had once seemed like a temporary fix for a broken system was now a defining aspect of how modern militaries would approach supply lines. It wasn't just about moving cargo. It was about ensuring that vehicles could keep moving under the most extreme conditions. The irony was undeniable. What had started as a seemingly insignificant change to an already existing design had ultimately reshaped the course of history. Calhoun's work, so often overlooked and dismissed by the military establishment during the war, had now become the blueprint for success. His simple modifications, made out of sheer necessity, had proven to be one of the most enduring and transformative contributions to the war effort. While commanders and generals may have been the public faces of victory, it was the unsung mechanics like Calhoun who had ensured that the war could continue, day after day, under the harshest of conditions. And so, as the war in Europe came to a close, Calhoun's legacy began to take root in the future of military logistics. His designs, once seen as impractical and unrefined, were now incorporated into industrial designs, changing the very nature of military supply chains. It was a turning point that many would never see coming. The future of military logistics, once governed by large, immovable machines, would now be shaped by the principles of durability, adaptability, and innovation, values that Calhoun had shown in his quiet work with the Red Ball Express. The legacy of the Red Ball Express, and the mechanic who had made it all possible, would endure far beyond the war. In the years to come, Calhoun's work would influence the design of military vehicles, ensuring that future generations of soldiers would have the tools they needed to keep fighting. In the quiet aftermath of war, it became clear that a mechanic's simple modifications had reshaped the course of history. What began as a desperate attempt to keep a fleet of trucks running had turned into a blueprint for the future, proving that innovation doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes, it comes from the humblest of places, the hands of men who were willing to do whatever it took to ensure that victory was never out of reach. And as the world moved forward into the post-war era, the question lingered. How many more innovations, hidden in the shadows of history, had changed the course of events without ever being fully recognized? Calhoun's story was just one among many, a reminder that history is often shaped by those who work quietly, without fanfare in the spaces between the grand narratives. His legacy lived on, not in monuments, but in the quiet efficiency of the machines that carried victory forward. With the announcement of VE Day in May 1945, the guns of war began to fall silent across Europe. The long struggle, the years of bloodshed and sacrifice had finally come to an end. Yet, for the Red Ball Express, the end was quieter than many would have imagined. The convoys, which had kept the Allies moving through the darkest days of the war, were quietly disbanded. The trucks, their engines still carrying echoes of months spent driving through the heart of Europe, were repurposed for other tasks or left to rust in storage yards. In a world suddenly turned towards peace, the lifeblood of the Allied advance faded into obscurity. Those who had once depended on the Red Ball Express for survival moved on, leaving behind a legacy that would remain unspoken for many years. The trucks that had delivered victory in countless battles were now forgotten relics of a time that no longer seemed to matter. Their contribution to the war, though critical, was soon overshadowed by more publicized victories: the capture of Berlin, the fall of the Reichstag, the announcement of unconditional surrender. The Red Ball Express, which had kept the front lines alive and fueled the momentum that brought about that final victory, slipped into the background. History's spotlight turned elsewhere, and the men who had driven those trucks, those unsung heroes, were left without the recognition they had so rightfully earned. They had delivered supplies, yes, but in a world celebrating its triumphs, their quiet efforts were swept aside. For Sergeant Walter Red Calhoun, the end of the war meant returning to a civilian life he had never truly prepared for. The mechanic who had, through sheer ingenuity, designed the modifications that kept the Red Ball Express rolling, now found himself back in the world he had left behind. His contribution to the war effort had been monumental, but in the silence that followed victory, it went largely unnoticed. Calhoun returned to his life before the war, his name unspoken in the halls of military glory. His work had changed the course of history, but no medals were given, no parades were held. He returned to the anonymity he had once known, his role in the war's outcome all but erased from the public consciousness. It wasn't until years later that the veterans who had lived through those harrowing months began to speak of the Red Ball Express with reverence. They knew the truth. Without those convoys, without those trucks, the war could not have been won. They had carried fuel, food, and ammunition through enemy territory, through bombed-out roads, through the relentless pressures of time and war. Yet the operation, despite its enormous impact, remained largely unknown to history. The trucks, now forgotten by the world, had been the very things that kept the front lines alive. The veterans remembered, but the larger world did not. The irony was stark. The Red Ball Express, the operation that had enabled victory, was soon lost to time. The veterans' stories, passed down in quiet conversations, painted a picture of the unseen work that had made victory possible. The men behind the trucks, behind the wheel, and behind the repairs were the true heroes. Yet history did not acknowledge them as such. Despite the monumental contribution the Red Ball Express had made to the Allied success, the soldiers and mechanics who had fueled the war were left largely forgotten. They had changed the course of history, but no one would remember their names, no one would thank them in the years to come. Their legacy was not carved into monuments or etched into the annals of war. It was buried in the daily grind of logistics, in the smoke of exhaust, and the hum of engines on long, endless roads. And so, as the world moved into the post-war era, the contributions of the Red Ball Express became just another forgotten chapter in history. The engines that had once roared across Europe went silent, their power now turned towards civilian uses, while the men who had driven them faded into the background. Their legacy, despite the impact they had made, would remain largely unrecognized by the world at large. The Red Ball Express had saved months of fighting, and yet its heroes, like Calhoun and countless others, would never receive the recognition they so richly deserved. The victory they helped secure would be remembered, but the road that made it possible would be left behind, as if it never truly mattered. As the world moved on, one question lingered. How many more unsung stories of sacrifice, of innovation born of necessity, would fade into the shadows of history? How many quiet heroes, like Calhoun, would never be fully recognized for their role in shaping the world? What they did not know was that the legacy of the Red Ball Express, though uncelebrated, had become an indelible part of the war's success, a quiet triumph that would live on in the systems that still carry the world's needs today. When Sergeant Walter Red Calhoun first presented his modified truck designed to military leaders, his idea was met with scorn. It was deemed too crude, too impractical. His concept for a truck that could be easily repaired in the field with reinforced frames and a simple, efficient engine was dismissed as worthless. The military brass, focused on heavier, more sophisticated models, scoffed at his suggestion, unable to see the value in simplicity. But what began as a laughable afterthought would soon become the very backbone of the Allied war effort. The Red Ball Express, a logistical lifeline that ran day and night across war-torn Europe, would prove that the most significant victories often come from the most overlooked innovations. As the war pressed on, Patton's forces relied on a fragile thread of supply lines to sustain their advance. It was a line that stretched to its breaking point, relying on Calhoun's trucks to transport fuel, food, and ammunition through the worst conditions imaginable. Every gallon of fuel delivered by those worthless trucks became a vital turning point in the war. Without them, victory could not have been achieved. The trucks, once dismissed as unreliable, were now the unsung heroes of the battlefield. What made Calhoun's design so vital was not its ability to withstand enemy fire, but its ability to keep moving day after day under the harshest conditions without breaking down. In the face of a brutal, ever-moving front line, the trucks became a symbol of resilience, of ingenuity, and of what could be achieved when necessity bred invention. The irony was profound. It wasn't the advanced weaponry or the brilliant strategies of generals that kept the Allies moving forward. It was the simple workhorse trucks, born of necessity, that carried the supplies and ensured the momentum of the war effort. The Red Ball Express marked a turning point not just in logistics, but in how wars are fought. It proved that logistics could be just as important as the weapons wielded by soldiers. Calhoun's trucks didn't just carry supplies, they carried the possibility of victory. For the first time, the world saw that battles weren't won just on the front lines, but also in the uncelebrated, unseen work of the men and machines that kept the army fed, fueled, and moving. It was the behind-the-scenes work that often determined success, and Calhoun's unheralded genius showed that sometimes the most critical component in warfare is not the weapon, but the logistics that make the weapon effective. As the war reached its final stages, the Red Ball Express proved its worth again and again, enduring through the cold of winter, the fog of war, and the exhaustion of the men who kept it running. Its contribution to the Allied victory was immense, yet its legacy remained largely uncelebrated. The true turning point of the war was not in a battlefield strategy, nor in a new weapon designed for destruction. It was in the quiet, relentless effort of those who made sure the war machine kept moving, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. In the grand narrative of history, the work of the Red Ball Express was relegated to the background, overshadowed by the more glamorous victories of generals and soldiers. But it was the trucks that carried victory through the hardest of times, and it was the men who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to keep them running that secured the final push toward Germany. The moral victory of the Red Ball Express was clear. Its success lay not in its flashiness or in the glory of battle, but in its ability to adapt, to endure, and to make a difference when it mattered most. The trucks, once deemed worthless, had rewritten the rules of warfare, showing that the true power of victory lies not in the firepower on the battlefield, but in the unsung work that supports it. And so, as the engines of the Red Ball Express finally went silent, their legacy remained intact. They built it to win a battle. It ended up rewriting history. The trucks that had been laughed at were now part of a greater story, one that would be told not by the soldiers who fought in the trenches, but by the machines that had helped them win. The road, once a place of struggle and sacrifice, had become the path to victory, and the trucks that traveled it would forever be remembered as the unsung heroes who made it all possible.